Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Penang Institute. Those of you who've been here before, welcome back. Um, I'm actually looking for. Yeah, okay. Um, so my name is Fawaz Abdulaziz. I'd like to again welcome everybody to our fairly regular book launch, book talk. Tonight's event, the speaker, Vaudine, England. And we'll be talking on the launch of her book, Hong Kong, The Tropical Mixing That Made It. Um, and I was supposed to kick it off fairly quickly because I understand Gareth Richards will be giving quite an extensive contextualization of the book by Vaudine. I think the moderator is getting his oxygen right now. We'll just wait for. Okay, good idea. For those who are not familiar with Penang Institute, we are established by the Penang State Government in 1997. We do policy research. We're in between the state and society in a way, policy research for the state while also working with society and yeah. So saved by Gareth Richards. Let me just call upon Gareth to come up on stage and kick off tonight's event. Gareth, floor is yours.
Hi. What a great turnout for a Monday night. Actually, when we were planning this, Vaudine said to me, how many people do you think will come? And she said about 15, max 20. And we said, no, we've got nearly 100 in the room. So a wonderful turnout. Thank you very much for supporting tonight's event. And of course, I want to thank Penang Institute, its team here, for hosting this event at quite short notice and so on. I'm going to take a little bit longer than usual with the introduction because I want to situate tonight's talk with some connections with Penang's own history. And I think that might be appropriate for us to think across parallels when we have the discussion tonight. A little bit about how this evening even came about. So a few weeks ago, I got an email from Vaudine because she'd been introduced to me by her former editor at the Far Eastern Economic Review, Philip Bowring. And Philip Bowring is well known to Penang Institute because in 2019, he won the Penang Book Award for his book, Empire of the Winds. And so once I had that connection through Philip, of course, Vaudine and I started a fairly intense email correspondence. And then I pitched the event to Ki Beng, who's busily reading the book in the front row. Don't disturb him. And within about an hour, he said, yep, that sounds like a good idea. And here we are. I mean, things can work in a very nice way when there's the will. And we certainly had that. So, of course, we're going to be concentrating tonight on the history of Hong Kong. But it's inevitable, as I mentioned just now, that we could also think about parallels with the history of Penang. Both similarities and, of course, differences between the two places. Both brought under the tutelage of British imperialism, the British Imperial Project, though more than 50 years apart, of course. Penang in 1786, Hong Kong in 1841. Penang taken, as we all know, via a cunning, not to say duplicitous, transaction between an English country trader, Francis Light, and the Sultan of Kedah. And Hong Kong, taken by the British after flexing muscles via the so-called gunboat diplomacy of the First Opium War, and ceding the island and its harbour as a British Crown colony. Both Penang and Hong Kong emerged as important port cities, whose economic fortunes lay in trade, above all, of course, the opium trade. Populations were decidedly cosmopolitan. Here's George Leith. Who's he? The first Lieutenant Governor of Penang, famously writing in 1801, and I quote, "There is not probably any part of the world where in so small a space so many different people are assembled together, or so great a variety of languages spoken." That's Leith in 1801. And here in 1848 is a diarist describing the throng of people he encountered in Hong Kong: the English, American, and Chinese, the Spanish, French, Portuguese, Persians, Bengalese, Javanese, and Manila Indians, the Germans, Italians, Russians, Danish, Swiss, Dutch, Belgian, Pole, and the Arab, Turk, Armenian, Tatar, Siamese, African, and South American. You get the picture. Even better, I think, are Vaudine's own words, told in a style brimming with panache and even ebullience. Who is her history about? She answers, "What of all the perfectly ordinary people who staffed the businesses, ran the taverns, stocked the ships' chandleries, and placed bets on the horses? What of all those multicolored people who lived, worked, loved, and died in the steep streets up from the central business district? Behind the grand facades of the First Court building, church and barracks, and the nouveau riche splendor of the Taipan's houses and offices was a busy catch-can world of coolie laborers, moneylenders, ship owners, shopkeepers, commission brokers, bar owners, and working women. The city was seeded by its Asian trades, and so it needed its Asian traders." That's Vaudine's central thesis of the whole book. One thing that Penang does not have, sadly, is a social history that describes and analyzes the rich, dynamic, complex social relations that emerged from the late 18th century onwards, not dissimilar to Vaudine's description of 19th century Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is deeply fortunate, no pun intended, for Vaudine's Fortune's Bazaar. It is nothing less than a rewriting of the British colony's past. It contains a wealth of detail from the archival record, first-hand accounts, interviews, and much, much more. And it's beautifully written, with empathy and tellingly also with humor. It's a brilliant story, well told. And it runs against the grain. In the face of this, the book asks two key questions. Has Hong Kong always been a Chinese city? That's the first question. Was it also a model British colony? And there's the tale of the two cities, Chinese and/or British. Tonight we'll discover the answer to both of those questions. A little bit about the author. Vaudine England was a journalist for 3 decades in Southeast Asia and also Hong Kong. She worked for the BBC, for Reuters, as I mentioned, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and a large number of London papers. I first read her work 2 decades ago in The Guardian. She's authored several books about individuals, about institutions, and about family companies in Hong Kong. And now she's based in Amsterdam. Please give a very warm Penang welcome to Vaudine, England.
Well, such a lovely introduction from such a lovely man. I'm extremely grateful to all of you, especially to Gareth, for making this happen. And both of all of you at the Penang Institute. He's already said it all, so there's almost nothing left for me to say, but you'll find that won't actually stop me. First of all, to explain, here, you'll see on the publicity thing that you looked at, you'll see the cover on the right, which is from the American publisher. Actually, I should have asked you to guess which was the American design and which was the British. And since we're talking about all sorts of maybe differences, not such big differences culturally, ethnically, whatever, you might have been able to guess which was which. The blue one on the left is the British design. And what's really, one might almost say kinky, is that in the publishing world still, when you have a British publisher, the distributor has the world carved up, and the British did the quote-unquote UK and Commonwealth rights, which interestingly included Hong Kong. Don't tell them, June. So obviously not technically correct, but that's why you get the blue cover out in Asia, and you'll get the American cover sometimes here, but more often in America. Now, the point of this PowerPoint is to remind me what I'm talking about, but before we get into that, thanks very much to Gareth's introduction. He says I should say a bit about me. Now, despite the surname, I'm actually from New Zealand. This is a really important point. But from the age of 10, I've been all over the place. Now, one of those places was Singapore in the 70s. So one of the reasons why I'm really happy and honored to be here tonight talking to you people is that in 1974, when my family drove us up for our first family holiday up to Penang from Singapore in a little Datsun, and we went to Batu Ferringhi. I mean, I can assure you, I had no idea that all these decades later, I would be here now talking to an august group of people at the Penang Institute. So thank you. I've always loved Penang from an early age. Now, I was going to say things about the connections between Penang and Hong Kong, but, you know, Gareth's already done that. But there are more connections. One of the things I found, an obscure little factoid in the course of endless obsessive research over decades, is that in the beginning of air transport, when people from Hong Kong were first going to fly to Britain, they first had to get themselves to Penang, and then they caught the plane from here to get them to Britain. So that's just the beginning of aviation. But there's more to it than that. Which I think will become clear, and in a way you already hinted at it. How you look at the history of a place, any place, depends on where you stand. Now, when you stand in Beijing and look at Hong Kong, you think, well, you know, that's part of us. When you stand in the south, in the tropics, actually, sorry, can we not have this aircon blasting on me? I'm going to lose my voice. But never mind. When you stand to the south of Hong Kong and you look up to Hong Kong from geographically, thank you. Hong Kong looks different. It looks like something, oh, maybe it's sort of really connected to Southeast Asia. And then when you look historically and you think, hang on a minute, you think of the trail of, indeed, port cities, as Gareth mentioned. You know, you can go back to Genoa and Venice, you can go to Aden, you can go to Bombay, Calcutta, Rangoon back in the day. Is that what you wanted? Yeah. And of course you come down through, you know, when these places were founded, Penang, then Singapore, and then Hong Kong appears really as a sort of, you know, afterthought virtually. It's the last place in this chain of port cities, depending from where you start, right? If you start in Europe. And it was in many ways a kind of terminus, and it was the last one to be founded, really, by foreign interest. I mean, I haven't even covered all the ones in Indonesia and, you know, other parts of Malaysia, etc. But so Hong Kong becomes part of a chain of port cities through this whole Southeast Asian region. And so, and because I was always in Hong Kong, because I liked coming to the tropics, not going north to the cold, I often, and because I did Southeast Asian studies at university, I always saw Hong Kong as part of Southeast Asia. I mean, although that's not politically correct, but just sort of conceptually, it grew out of that trade, obviously, when you look at the map. How did it grow out of that trade? Well, as Gareth has suggested, and as many of you know from Penang, what's absolutely crucial to it all is the trading diasporas who made those port cities work. So it's the movement of those people through all those cities who then themselves turned up in Hong Kong. Now, I need the PowerPoint to tell me to move on. Because what was essential in all of this, and this is the other point of perspective that I think is really important in history. I mean, I'm obsessive about archives and records and stuff, and the biggest, most important contribution, whether they liked it or not, they had very little choice in the matter, to all of this mixing and to all of this society formation is the women who, at least in Hong Kong, I am yet to be informed about here, have no voice. They do not appear in the records. They do not appear in history. They were basically what we would now call trafficked into Hong Kong as different variations of sex worker. And these are the women who literally, I like to get right down to basic facts, you'll hear more of this, they literally produced the children who became the mixed race people about whom I'm talking most. And this is so first of all, we have an untold history because these women couldn't write, didn't write, there are no records. There's only one we know about because she was written about in a newspaper for all sorts of reasons, basically because of who her man was. Ain't that typical? So then their story is untold. And then for many generations, at least in Hong Kong, the families that were the result of many of these liaisons didn't want the story told because who wants to admit, oh yeah, great-grandma was a hooker? I mean, nobody really wants to sort of say that, right? But I think now we're at a point where there are families who are now proud to say in Hong Kong that they are of this mixed heritage. It's quite a different thing in Hong Kong compared to Southeast Asian definitions of Eurasian. There's, you know, everybody has their own definition. So as a typical academic, I made up my own definition, which hopefully is explained early on in the book. I use this word Eurasian, but I interpret it in the broadest possible sense. I've decided it means the entire geographical continent of Eurasia, because I was thinking, how do I talk about all these people who come from Armenia, Iraq, India, Persia, and all the places in between, including, of course, China, and all the places around here. So I thought, well, only the geographical term is going to cover all that. And so I've made a new definition of Eurasian. So that basically includes pretty well all of us in this room, one way or another. We can all claim some association. But it's thanks to these women. Now, maybe I should explain a bit more yes. So there were a bunch of traders in Canton in the, leading up to 1841. Foreign traders were all confined to a particular small area of Canton, which is now Guangzhou in South China. And they were very constrained by the Chinese government as to what they were allowed to do and where they could go, and they couldn't bring their women with them, and it was, and so, in one of these marvelous slates of hand, the British, in the name of free trade, decided they had to teach China a lesson in this first Opium War and open up China to trade, whether China really wanted it or not. As a result, Hong Kong was initially just seen, these opium traders based in Guangzhou, they needed a place to store their opium. They wanted a safe harbor for their ships full of opium. That was the initial idea of Hong Kong. Things quickly took off, in many ways completely unplanned by the British, and talk about a story of unintended consequences. All kinds of people either preceded or closely followed the British traders as they landed in Hong Kong. And here we come to the first problem. What do we mean by British? Which you also hinted at. Let me just see what the next... we'll go back. You're not ready for that yet. Few people are. When they say British traders, actually, very few of them were what you might think of as British. I mean, white guys from England, to be blunt. First of all, they were mostly Scots. We know they're very different. But no, I'm being flippant. But a large number of them were, in fact, Parsi. Now, the Parsis, probably many of you know, originally from Persia, Zoroastrians who had, in a large numbers, migrated to Bombay for quite a few generations and had traded early on first with Portuguese through Bombay and then with the British, and were really important trading partners to whoever the foreigners happened to be at the time. So once the British got Hong Kong, they then moved with the British via Canton. Actually, many of them, the first Parsi to get to Canton in 1785, and I never forget his name, Mr. Ready Money. No, of course, it's not his original name, it's the name he was given. So the Parsis were already a strong trading contingent in Guangzhou, and they were among the very first people who went with who identified as British. We're British, we're Parsi, but we're British, to Hong Kong. So when you have a first land auction in Hong Kong in 1841, many of the first buyers of land, so this is not people just coming through or whatever, they're actually buying land in this place that hasn't been settled, has almost nobody there, nothing happening, are Parsi. They're Parsi people. So that's really kind of interesting. Now, when I started looking at all of this idea of the tale of two cities. I mean, I was a journalist, right? I was coming to history. I sometimes now kind of call myself a historian. I am a historian. But in the beginning, as a journalist, I was thinking, hang on, my idea of all of this is not what the official historians are saying. The official historians were saying, hey, the reason why Hong Kong worked is because, the Chinese were over there and the British were over there and they were allowed to get on with doing whatever they wanted to do. They didn't bother each other. That's why Hong Kong worked. And I thought, but that's really kind of weird, because actually, when you look at what actually happened and who actually did what, they were sleeping together most nights. I mean, literally. So I'm sorry to be so basic about it, but that is the fact. So I thought, okay, do I dare to go against this sort of orthodoxy about, what British people are, what Chinese people are? And I'm sure people in this room know that the word Chinese can mean a lot of different things. There's a lot of different kinds of Chinese, and there's a lot of variations within. So, these words are not good enough as far as I'm concerned. But I thought, okay, how do I prove this? And I thought, well, I've got to kind of get down to nuts and bolts. Who actually arrived? Who actually got off the ships? Who actually got off first? What did they do? Where did they live? Why were they there? Who were they busy with? And who did they have relationships with? And what did the product of those relationships then do? And where did they live? And what did they do? So it was kind of course, it took a Dutch professor to teach me a new word in English. Apparently what I was doing is called prosopography. Anyway, I thought of name card, prosopographist, but no. Tracking not just individuals, but their networks. And so when, for example, a guy called Leonardo d'Almada turned up on one of the first ships in 1841, he was an aide-de-camp to British Captain Elliot. He wasn't just a lone guy. I mean, he had a brother, but he had a whole Portuguese network behind him, which meant that a whole bunch of other Portuguese from nearby Macau came soon after, which meant that they brought the printing machines because these guys knew about printing. And so they began the publishing industry. So it wasn't just like one person turned up or one Parsi turned up. They brought the whole Parsi network, which goes right back through Southeast Asia, South Asia, to Middle East and beyond. And it goes back through Singapore, Penang, different parts of Burma, India, whatever you want to call it. So that's Portuguese and Parsis, and then I thought, hang on a minute, there's some Armenians chucked in here, and they're first arriving pretty early on as well. Why are they here? And actually, a lot of them are coming to Hong Kong from Calcutta, and I bet you all know, of course, the Sakis, Armenians out of Calcutta, founding the Eastern and Oriental Hotel and the Strand in Rangoon, and so on and so forth. The Apcar shipping line out of Calcutta, going through all these places, Rangoon, Penang, Singapore, to Hong Kong and back. And so, I think, oh shit, how did they turn up? And then another major trading diaspora in the world, of course, is the Jewish. And so they were moving through all these places, many of them out of Baghdad, Baghdadi Jewish families. You've all heard of the Sassoons. In Hong Kong, we know very well the Kaduris. And there are many others, but I found some really interesting little obscure families in the beginning who turned up, and everyone had varied fortunes. And that's another point. Everyone thinks, oh, you arrive in Hong Kong, you make a fortune, you made. And of course, lots of people didn't. They just sort of carried on their normal lives and actually built a society without having to be dramatic about it. So as a result of all of this, you get things like this. I mean, I had a bit of a traumatic time trying to sort out a lot of families. And I can tell you this is just an early phase drawing, but it's trying to explain what is happening. It's not wholly accurate. It's since been vastly improved because, there were lots of families who talked to me in the process, but after publication, then people come and say, oh, that's not right. And then anyway, if I can do this without the mic. You see in the top left, you've got 4 lamb sisters. Now, the first 2, imagine this in the records, Fong Q and Q Fong. Can you imagine how often that got mixed up? And they were twins. So now, I think in the book I explained this whole thing, this euphemism of being a protected woman. In other words, a version of mistress with a certain status, and hopefully, if your foreign trader man who's so-called protecting you is a decent guy, he might give you an apartment, you might be able to make a living out of it. Lots of them didn't. Lots of them left you literally holding the baby and having to cope on your own. They'd be there for a year and leave. Anyway, the 4 Lamb sisters, between them, had connections with various big famous traders of Hong Kong. And it's only through the colors that I could get to. Don't worry about the details. The point is by the 3rd or 4th generation. So the line across the bottom, you've got German Overbeck, Chinese Li Xing, Portuguese Lobo, Dr. George, and the Coatwells and the Zimmons are all intermarried, and they've got Jewish blood. And over here, you've got Portuguese. And you've, along here, most of these names, to any Hong Kong person who knows their history a little bit, that is the late 19th, early 20th century elite of Hong Kong. These are the guys and women with the money and the power. And it starts, from 4 women who basically had to work pretty hard for the money. And so, I'm not going to sing. We leave that to June. I mean, I'm skipping over a whole lot of things, but any of you who know your Malacca history will know that the Choi Lip Chi family, his ancestor at some point was the Capitan China in Malacca. So it's a much earlier version of Chinese who came to the Straits, came to Malacca way early, and then went back, not to China, but to Hong Kong, and as a comprador for Taikou. So anyway, you can see, I got a bit kind of tangled and overwrought about these matters. Now, he's one of my favorite guys, Belilios, that's how you pronounce it. And my reason for why he's so, it's not that he kept a pet camel and, you know, had a menagerie on the peak and all of this kind of thing. His family is originally Sephardic Jewish, out of Venice, went to Calcutta because of the opium trade. He went early to Hong Kong, 1860s, to, you know, pursue the opium trade. He already had a Jewish wife in Calcutta, left her there. Once in Hong Kong, got very cozy with the boss's daughter of his local trader, a local agent, and started a whole Hong Kong Chinese family, many of whom were on that previous sort of messy drawing. And so basically had a second family in Hong Kong. Now, everybody knew this, and they sure as hell knew it when the Calcutta wife also turned up in Hong Kong. So here is a man who had two families. Now, we're told that, oh, no, this sort of thing, you know, this is the tale of two cities. We're like completely separate. We're not bothering anybody. Now, Berlioz was on the board of the Hong Kong Bank. He was a member of LegCo. He was, you know, these are all the status markers for someone absolutely respectable in the eyes of the British. Of course, we all know he has two families, but never mind. And it's in fact his Chinese family that in terms of power and influence in Hong Kong is way more important than his Indian Jewish family. I'm sorry for her, but that's the fact. We all know this, we don't mind. But when he gets to Britain at some point and ends up dying in Britain, and there's an obituary about him, it talks about how he was a great fan of Disraeli and, you know, all sorts of things. And it talks about his Jewish wife, et cetera, et cetera. There is no mention of his Chinese family. No mention of how significant these people are. They're running the opium syndicate. They're setting up, they're in Tung Wah Hospital. All the status, prestigious markers of having made it in Hong Kong society are held by members of his Chinese family. But as far as the official record goes, it doesn't exist. So I thought, oh my goodness. Okay, here's a very obvious example of a guy whose whole double life, his second and frankly more important life, is absolutely not in the records. It's not there. So now, as Alicia knows, if for any journalist, here's a story that's just not told. And the fun about doing history is you can more easily find scoops, frankly. You can find a lot of stuff that hasn't been told. And that's kind of what got me hooked on this. So I thought, oh, no, this is something that hasn't been dealt with. So there he is, buried in Hong Kong, actually. He's got a stone there. Now, then we get to the famous Armenian of Calcutta. On the left, that's Paul Chater. Well, Paul Katchik Chater, one of a bunch of orphaned children. He was going to be a surveyor, sort of like Kim, you know, in Kipling, in Calcutta, but he left all that, 1862, turns up in Hong Kong, works at the bank, the Hindustani Bank, meets his best friend and business partner for life, the Parsi, Mr. Modi on the right. And if you remember Modi Road and Chimsey and all that sort of place, that's him. The house is Chater's house because he kind of did rather well. He starts out as a bank clerk. He becomes very close to the Sassoons. How does that work? He's Armenian Christian. He's best friends with the Sassoons, who are obviously Jewish, who were big in Hong Kong at that time. And for all sorts of complicated reasons, which are too long to say for all your attention here tonight, the Sassoons effectively left Hong Kong in 1902. Interestingly, they had a bunch of land leases in Central, which they handed over to Chater. Interestingly, Chater himself had worked out this brilliant deal, and we're not talking about insider trading or conflict of interest. None of that existed then, okay? It just didn't happen. He got the merchants to agree with the government. He was a member of the legislative and executive councils in the government. He was a big trader. He got them together to make a deal for how to reclaim the harbor of Hong Kong so that you could extend, if anyone of you have been there, you know, everything in front of the tram line is new land, thanks largely to this guy here on the left, Mr. Chater. So he first of all made the deal for the reclamation. He set up a company called Hong Kong Land to exploit the land. He was then chairman of the Hong Kong Club, which got a slot on the land. And he built what is now the Mandarin Hotel, was something else then. Queen's Building was called. Prince's Building, Alexander House, Chater House. That's all thanks to him. Because these were the reclaimed land lots in front of the land that the Sassoons had handed over to him. So you get this sort of incredible nexus here. Very little of it has anything to do with British rule. Have you noticed? These are trading networks from way back with links back to Southeast Asia, back to India and beyond, who are doing business with each other, and they are actually literally building Hong Kong. So, and then when I was writing about the history of Hong Kong land at one point, now in Hong Kong you think, oh, that's an archetypal British home. It's a British company. And then I discovered, because I, in my usual pedantic way, I went through all the minutes of the first 50 years of Hong Kong land, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Through 50 years in this British company, there is one Scots guy on the board. He's from Jardines. Every single other member of the board for 50 years is Jewish, Armenian, Parsi, or Eurasian. And then one Chinese, Li Xin. So I thought, okay, this kind of helped me redefine who are the people of Hong Kong, right? Are they British? Are they Chinese? Well, basically, no. Yes and no to all of the above. So these guys had a lot to do with it. And you can see as a result, this is Major Samuel Churn on the right. And there are people here who are not unrelated. And he's a marvelous mixture. And incredibly, there's even a woman in his parents' history called Lily Brown. I didn't warn you about that. No, but it's a mystery, but we'll talk about that later. But descendants of Samuel Churn and Trixie over here on the left, I mean, you can see, you talk about Peranakan being mixed culture and everything. I mean, look at this. What is she? British, Chinese, whatever. She's a bit of everything. I think she's stunning, actually. I like the look. Anyway, descendants of the guys are still paying grave maintenance fees for 2 great-grandmothers because they're not sure which one is the right one. So, you can't always get a clear answer. And here we have the offspring of the most famous family of Eurasians, the Ho Tungs, Robert Ho Tung and his brother Ho Kam Tong. And I'm not going to go through all of this because you're going to fall asleep, but there's a chapter about them. But he's the product of I'm sorry to say, since I'm now Dutch, but of a Dutch guy who left the Chinese lady holding the babies, literally. So Robert Ho Tung got really determined that he was going to make his way regardless, and that he was going to support his mother, though she'd been a sex worker, basically. Even though she was probably involuntarily subjected to that kind of work, she made sure, and she had no education herself, she made sure her boys went through Central School, which was this early institution in British colonial life that was actually multiracial and multilingual, and mixed race boys could go there and get exactly the kind of bilingual education. And I don't just mean language, I mean everything, culture, bilingual culture education, which made them the perfect intermediaries, which made them incredibly wealthy. And this is then the next generation doing rather well, as you can see. And this is one of the concubines. That was another problem with Andrew Chair. He was tracking Ho Kam Tong, his families. And, at one point they thought they'd got down to 9 concubines, and then he'd call me up and say, no, it's actually, I think it's 12 or maybe 13. They weren't sure. Anyway, it's a sad comment about treatment of women, obviously, but it's they were status symbols and objets. And as a result, you got these mansions that the Eurasian clans could build. This was Ho Tung summer houses in Tai Tam. Any of you knowing Hong Kong where the American Club, Country Club is now? It used to be these houses. And this is when I realized, gosh, I really must be nuts, because I actually got a photographer friend of mine in the 80s to photograph these houses, long before I knew I was going to do anything like this. Because I thought, if we don't get pictures of these houses now, they're not going to last, they'll be gone. So luckily, I have them. And there's Robert Ho Tung. Well, could be either, couldn't it? Depending on which outfit you're wearing. Robert Ho Tung, in the Chinese outfit, he's the son of the Dutch guy and the Chinese woman. He's standing next to George Bernard Shaw, and they had a great joke going on about how they looked quite similar if they had only worn different clothes. I mean, slight exaggeration, but you can see from the look that we're used to people who look mixed, right? You don't think about it, and we're not supposed to ask, hey, but where are you really from? Oh, and was your grandma? Oh, you know, we don't ask it, but I do. So that's why you had the book. And then you can see Robert Ho Tung again on the left. The next guy is Robert Coatwell. Now, if you look carefully, he looks a wee bit different. And that's because his father was Parsi with a Chinese mother. And what I find, I mean, hysterical is too strong a word. What I find interesting is that Robert Coatwell, with a Parsi father, was the first Chinese representative to reach the Executive Council as a representative of the Chinese. And he's half Parsi. So that's interesting. The other interesting thing is that it's Robert Coatwell's grandson, Ron Zimmern, who partly inspired me to get going on this book. So it's very interconnected, and in the end, small world, isn't it, June? Yeah. Anyway, you can see that virtually everybody in this photo, except perhaps the tallest British bureaucrat, you know, has some kind of mixing going on, right? And this is Patsy Coatwell. She's a daughter of the man I was just telling you, and she's marrying her nice, handsome Eurasian John Fenton. And when I showed this picture once at the Hong Kong Club, one of the Zimmern girls, she said, "Oh, that's me." She's the bridesmaid on the left, the countess. So again, you can see everybody, this family includes, you've got Chinese, Portuguese, Jewish, and Parsi blood in this one picture, okay? At least that. There's probably bits I've missed. Yeah. Anyway. And then we come to families that are not normally included in the sort of normal Eurasian package, whatever that might be. But again, an example of how Hong Kong, as Penang was, as I think any port city must be, open to everybody. So this family is great fun, right? But they arrived in the 1930s. They're originally from Hyderabad, Sindh. So although they identify as Indian, their home base is now part of Pakistan, which is confusing for them. And they arrived in Hong Kong as a family of 6 in one room in Sham Shui Po in deepest Kowloon with nothing. And Harry Layla and his older brother were hawking toothbrushes outside the barracks in Kowloon, the British barracks, and gradually got into tailoring, gradually got into property, gradually built the Holiday Inn, Golden Mile in Tsim Sha Tsui. And in one generation went from that sort of poverty to what I mean in the nicest possible way. I mean, billionaire blingdom, really. And I'm not saying that the British were marvelous in doing this. I'm saying that as a port city, there were possibilities to do things that you couldn't do at home, right? And everybody did. So they were another project I was working on separately, but they also kind of fed into this thinking, hang on, what are they? I mean, they say they're Hong Kong people, or they're what do they say? Hindians, not just Indian, but Hong Kong Indians. So, who are the Hong Kongers, of course, became quite a subject in the last few decades in Hong Kong, and I wasn't immune. Now, why have I got this in here? Oh, yes, because this is about the forming of Hong Kong's identity very much as Hong Kong, separate at that time in everybody's mind to China. This is in 1967. And this is a picture by Hugh Van Ness. And what's really interesting here is that little red book waving cadres from China were coming into Hong Kong. But the Hong Kong establishment and the Hong Kong police, which, as you can see, is mostly apparently Chinese, were standing up for something that was different. They were standing up for what they saw as Hong Kong. So there's a lot of debate about this, and I should probably skip quickly over it, not least because here we have on the left 2014 and 2019 in Hong Kong, when you had huge protests of all kinds. But again, it's this question of, you know, who are the Hong Kongers and who really sort of form the personality of a place. Now, this is all very recent, and I stress that my book fundamentally stops in 1949. But it's only by looking at exactly who is doing what on the ground step by step that I kind of got to a point of thinking, of redefining for me what Hong Kong was all about. And haven't I talked enough? Do you think I've talked enough? I think I've talked enough. Yeah, I've talked enough. Now, I know Gareth is going to pin me down with sticky questions, but if any of you want to mull something over, please feel free. Do I take this with me? Or you've got that? I should take this with me? I got it. Mm-hmm.
Well, I thought that deserved a round of applause. It's kind of delayed gratification, wasn't it?
It was forced from a captive audience. Yes.
My mic's not working. Sorry. No. It's not. I'm not on. Please on me. Thank
He's
you.
on.
It's a very Malaysian. We said in preparation that I'd like you to do a little bit on the biographical. You know, who is Vaudine, England, and of course you mentioned your holiday to Batu Ferringhi. I'd like you to just say a little bit more about you. I'm sure the audience would actually like to know the personality behind this wonderful book. And you turned to journalism. Why was that? Belatedly, you said you discovered the joys of history. Tell us a little bit more about that particular journey from journalism and into historian.
Right. Ooh. Well, just briefly.
Easy question.
Yeah, really. Allegedly, I informed my parents in my early teens that I was going to be a journalist. I have no recollection of this, but apparently that was the idea from early on. I remember thinking I wanted a job that would let me travel. And, you know, I thought, well, do I have to be a barmaid or a nurse? No, let's be a journalist. No. I think partly also because I was brought up by missionary parents. I was very much looking for a way not to be a missionary and not to be a participant, but rather to be an observer. And I'd rather sit on the edge and look at things. I'd rather be a little bit of an outsider. And also the fact of my upbringing, and some of you will recognize this, we moved house, thanks to the Lord, every 2 or 3 years of my life, basically, and often internationally. So I was already an outsider. So I think journalism was a natural fit. I actually, you know, when I started on a newspaper in Hong Kong, the Standard in, well, I'm not going to say when, it's too aging. Let's just say it was in the 80s. And I was just planning to earn a bit of money and go back to New Zealand and discover my roots. Well, that never happened because I got hooked. I mean, another way of explaining journalism is, in a way, it's a kind of a bad drug. You know, you get hooked on it. There's nothing to beat the blast of covering a breaking news story and getting it out there and telling the world something. So, however, journalism, first of all, as a way of life is not healthy particularly, but more seriously, it is not very easy anymore to do it in a way that was fun. Now that we have internet and websites, I mean, the last job I had for the BBC was editing the website. Now, what this meant was I was chained to a computer from 9 to 5. I was not allowed out. The whole idea of going out and reporting and meeting people and asking questions, that was just a no-no. I was there to process content as fast as possible for clicks. And that's what a lot of journalism has now become. And I find that really not only just really boring, but obviously rather tragic. And I think other things happen as a result of that. Meanwhile, way back in the 90s, I'd come across this guy, Carl Smith. He was a friend of my parents. And he was meant to be a missionary priest. He went a bit off-piste. He thought he's the one who started looking at Hong Kong from the ground up. Who are these people I'm supposed to be training to be priests or whatever? I don't think he ever got around to training any priest at all, because he was obsessed with this question, who are these people, for like 50 years. And some of you will remember little index cards and drawers that are just the right size for index cards. His apartment in Hong Kong was not big, but every wall was covered in these drawers full of index cards on every person he'd ever tracked in Hong Kong. And he'd tracked them in the most basic way possible from the beginning, just from birth, death, and marriage notices in newspapers. Then he'd spend a couple of years in the land registry tracking them all. That's how we find people like the Lamb sisters. I mean, talk about obsessive. Lovely man, no longer with us, but totally inspiring. And there was a moment when my mum said, you know, if Carl dies and we haven't sorted out his index cards, you know what you're going to have to do, don't you? No, I want to be a journalist. So there was this kind of thread early on, I guess. And I like this business of digging down. And what I say about the history work is that it is investigative reporting, but it's on a different time scale. And it's still dealing with a lot of stories that haven't been told. So I guess is that good enough?
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the most striking connections between the journalism and the historian is actually the quality of the writing and just how engaging it is. It's driven by storytelling, absolutely. So it's not, for example, so much modern history. I studied history, Asian history as well. There's kind of driven by the big thesis. There is an argument there, but the thesis comes out of the storytelling, which I think is really well done. But it's also just let me say it again, the quality of the writing, the panache, the ebullience, the humor, all of that aspect. I think mainly professional historians are not taught those particular sets of skills.
That's because, as I was discussing with my journalist friend earlier this evening, as a journalist, you get crushed into submission as a writer. I mean, my very first year as a journalist, this does age me, we still had manual typewriters. Anybody in this room who wants to be a writer, get a manual typewriter. Because what it makes you do is really think about what you have to write before you start typing, and because otherwise you're going to have to redo the whole page. And also, I mean, I had this news editor, and she would come along and she would just tear the paper out of the typewriter and just tear it up and saying, that's just dreadful, start again, and you've got 10 minutes to deadline. So old school journalists like me were trained in the school of hard knocks, you know, to tell that story and tell it tight. Over to you, Gareth.
I'm going to shift gears slightly. Let's come to the book itself. So quite clearly from what Vaudine's presentation elucidated, I mean, yours is a story of a society of in-between people. This is the motif that runs throughout the book, and especially, I like it, your very novel version of what a Eurasian is. And I like the fact that it crisscrosses the Eurasian continent. Now, to my mind, this particular kind of history of Penang is largely invisible. I'm talking about of Penang. Yeah, absolutely. This idea of admixture, this idea of the in-between people. I think partly because both the British and of course the post-colonial Malaysian government has rigidly adhered to a classification system that is strictly Malay, Chinese, Indian, and other just gets marginalized and invisibilized
I mean,
in
the other
process. Yeah. But it seems to me, I mean, having read 2 or 3 of the major histories of Hong Kong, this was also the case until you wrote your book, that this way of looking at Hong Kong society was also pretty marginalized and invisible. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, I think every ruling power anywhere likes to define their own narrative, rewrite their own history to justify their existence, explain their presence, whatever it might be. So, of course, when you read early British versions of Hong Kong, it's just such a marvelous story of progress and coherence and brilliant governance and terrific governors and bankers and all sorts that, you know, coming out from Britain and doing good work in the East and making a fantastic place. And of course, there's always this cliche attached, and the Chinese are so hardworking, it's really good. You know, it just is all this sort of, that's the British kind of idea. Of course, I say the Chinese version, but what I mean is the post-1949 Chinese version is not just of Hong Kong, but from the early 1800s, is of the century of humiliation, when all sorts of foreign powers did indeed barge into China and take chunks in different ways, not only the British, and trading concessions here and there in Shanghai and different parts of Beijing and so on, and other trading ports. And so for the post-war Chinese narrative, what you will learn is that, oh, actually, Hong Kong was never a colony. That's what is now officially said. Hong Kong is never a colony. It was occupied territory, and it was a humiliation, and it was all wrong. So, and interestingly enough, they said that already in 1972 at the United Nations, that, you know, that's why the situation of Hong Kong and Macau would be dealt with when the time is ripe. So, you know, they each had their own versions to suit their own statecraft. I'm not going to be bold enough to say that that's what happens here as well, because who knows? I don't. But each state does it all the time. We all have our own versions. And I think the way around that is to say, well, yeah, is to be Maoist. Let's seek truth from facts. Who actually was here? Who actually did what? Where did they come from? What did they do? Let's track that. And as you could see, it gets messy. But I think I'm a bit shocked that it hasn't been done here. Let's do it. Because some of these families are the same families. I mean, honestly, there's a prequel I'd love to do for some of these families that really came before they got to Hong Kong. Really, it's kind of interesting.
Ki Beng will commission you to write a social history of Penang. Actually, if somebody wrote, yeah. No, honestly, if somebody, we're really, really poorly served for Penang's history. And if somebody wrote a readable, accessible history or especially a social history of Penang, they could actually retire on the royalties. I'll be your agent. Write the book. Yeah, I like the cliche of the British calling the Chinese hardworking, but given your missionary background, I just want to quote you from page 86. This is a British missionary. The 3 great vices of the conduct of the Chinese are opium smoking, fornication, and gambling. There we are. That's the summary.
All the fun stuff. Yeah.
You come. I want to pick up. We talked a little bit about this beforehand. I want to pick up on 2 very interesting notions of the word mosaic. Right. One's obvious. We'll come to that in a moment. But when I was looking at the methodology that Vaudine actually uses, telling this story from genealogies, from land registries and church records and wills and so on. It seemed to me she was creating a mosaic of methods, you know, and that she uses this word tiles. And I found that interesting. So, of course, mosaics are tiny little tiles. So tell us a little bit about how your methodology captured this history of the everyday. And I'm glad you've already mentioned Carl Smith. I mean, he's an absolute hero of this book.
He is a hero. He's a wonderful man. He was a wonderful man. Maybe he still is. And he was incredibly generous. And it seems so sort of obvious in retrospect what he did. But it was incredibly painstaking and time-consuming, and you know, he ended up having no income at all, and people in the church were looking after him, and my mum thought he needed feeding up, and he was already kind of big. But so yeah, he was fantastic, and he was inspiring, and he was the mentor for what not only me but other historians of Hong Kong call the Hong Kong school of history. So, you know, you have your British, you have your Chinese, but there's actually a Hong Kong school of history where you actually sort of go from the ground up and look at actually Hong Kong from the point of view of Hong Kong, not from any other larger space. And so other historians like Elizabeth Sin, who did the history of the Tung Wah group and the Polum Cook and so on, and Christopher Munn and John Carroll, they all really come from the work. Without Carl Smith, they couldn't have got started. So, okay. Yeah, this thing about methodology. When I first wrote this book, it was a humongous thing. It was about twice the size. And it was a sort of compilation of everything I'd found out. So, you know, it wasn't really readable or anything. And so then to make it into a book that, you know, nice normal people would actually maybe manage to read, although I know there's still too many complicated names, for which I apologize. I had to take whole chunks out. Now, the way to take whole chunks out without grief was to form a folder on the side called PhD and put all the really sort of heavy shit into that folder. So that I got still, I mean, this is a slimmed down version. Anyway, so that meant once I moved to the Netherlands and I found a very nice professor who knew of me from when I'd been a journalist in Indonesia. And of course, in Holland, there's a lot of Indonesia studies. And he said, yeah, sure, come to, you know, Leiden and everything. And I said, yeah, but I'm not working on Southeast Asia anymore. I'm working on Hong Kong. And he said, oh, well, I think we can say Hong Kong's part of Southeast Asia, don't you? And that's kind of also part of where some of the thinking came from. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I made up a PhD out of the heavy version of this book. And so you get to a final draft of the PhD, and of course academic demands are different. And I had to explain my methodology. And I thought, well, I just kind of looked into things and asked people and, you know, talked to people. And okay, so I then had to explain that out. And of course, it's the kind of thing that journalists take for granted, that, you know, I would just cold call people, or I would, you know, practice what I call encirclement. You know, there's one sort of sticky grandmother over there. She won't answer me if I call her straight, but she's really fond of that son who's a friend of so-and-so who is connected to this person who I know. So I'll check, you know, I'll go through that and I'll get eventually to grandma. Now that to me is just normal sort of journalistic behavior, but I had to spell it out for, oh, that's really interesting, said the nice Dutch academics. And they ended up saying that journalistic skills were really an interesting part of it. Now, British academics are different. They turn their nose up and say, oh, you were a journalist, ooh. You know, that wasn't kind of quite so accepted. So obviously, the business of tracking down people and getting them to talk to me and getting them to open their attics and getting them to get their photo albums out and to sit, I can't tell you how many pots of tea, going through photo albums and saying, well, you know, this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and then like, oh my God. And, you know, hours and hours of this stuff. So, and I got kind of gripped. So that was one element. That's one part of the mosaic. Obviously, Carl Smith's records, that's a very crucial archive. And then there are other archives, hopefully from banks, the Hong Kong Bank, even the Standard Chartered Bank has a great archive in London. Swires, Jardines have archives. And then Chater, the important Armenian guy, has a descendant called Liz Chater. She's a marvelous woman who's sort of made a life work out of, her home in South England. She's got plastic tubs just full of stuff. And she let me go through it all and so on. So you just sort of persevere, basically. So there's archives, there's interviews, there's records, and, you know, being sort of dogged, being a pain in the ass.
The second notion of mosaic is that's the key word that you actually use to describe the society itself. I mean, that becomes the metaphor. You say, rather than using, say, melting pot or other descriptors. And I go back to this idea of this, like, small tiles of family and genealogies and so on put together. I think that's really, really an effective way of capturing that particular complex reality.
I'm lucky to have this fan, aren't I? It's really nice.
Okay, shall we move on, because time's moving on. So when I was rereading the book, this is the second time I've read it, and the nice stories of bands in taverns. I like those stories, like fifes and drums and whatever. So I really think the proper subtitle, I mean, your subtitle is really boring. It should be sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Believe me, this is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of Hong Kong. We need to talk about sex. Anyone who's of a sensitive disposition, the door is there. You've been forewarned. Now, sex features a lot in this book, from the brothels of Hong Kong to the relationships and marriages across those. So this is absolutely fascinating. It's very little featured in histories of the region. There's a little bit of work done on this in the Philippines, a little bit of work in Indonesia. Absolutely not in Malaysia. There is no sex.
I knew that was coming.
In Malaysia. There's a really great chapter that's titled Honey. Remind me of a Bessie Smith song or whatever, you know. You do all understand what honey is a euphemism for? Do I need to spell it out? No, I don't need to. And you make this. This is a really nice assertion in the book. Many are the histories and sweeping claims about racial segregation of empire. The British and the Chinese had no intimate connection, and you said this before, yet they were sleeping together most nights. Now, it seems to me that this kind of observation, and now I'm being quite serious, enables you to say a lot about racism. It enables you to say a lot about sexism, the subordinate place of women in Hong Kong society, but also some of the enterprising ways in which women were able to use these unequal relationships as forms of self-advancement. I mean, I think this is one of the core theses at the center of your book, yeah? Sex.
Yes.
Let's talk about it.
Is that a question? No. It's... I think the sexism in the historical record is interesting because it's not an unfamiliar story here or anywhere else in the region that, there's marriage number one, then there's relationship or marriage number 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever. But what is happening in Hong Kong, and I guess it happened, I don't know enough here, so you just, you have this woman on the side. Well, that's not important. Now, what becomes really interesting early on is one of the guys at Jardines, which is, the biggest opium trader, quite instrumental in the founding of Hong Kong. One of the Jardines guys actually in his office has a portrait of his woman, which is really astounding, don't you think? So that in this earlier phase of colonial enterprise in Hong Kong, that was okay. And, you know, he was saying, I'm in love with this Chinese woman. Here's her portrait on the wall. You know, this is something. By the time you get to sort of late 19th century, there's all sorts of theories about why. It's become a little bit more prudish, and it's not, you don't get guys putting their pictures of their lady loves on the wall anymore. But they still, some of them doing, well, I said all this, you know, some of them are doing the right thing and some are not. But this whole question, and why there's a chapter about brothels and sex, is that the man who inspired me to get going on this book, saying, you know, so my great-grandfather, you know, Parsi guy, you know, and he met this Chinese woman. How, where would they meet? And I was saying, well, you've sort of heard of brothels, I guess, you know. But it's also, it's not only, I mean, you know, that's again another word which has a million meanings, right? I mean, you meet in the trading house. Some women, there are differences between the status of Chinese women and in different Southeast Asian societies. I think women had a little bit more agency, as we might say, in the marketplace. They were often important traders. Definitely, as far as I know of Indonesian history and some of the Malay ports, much earlier, you know, pre-colonial rule. Chinese women had, I think, far less control over their own existence. And so, but again, in Hong Kong, you didn't only have Chinese women who were constrained in these ways. You had Asian, you had Malay women, there were Japanese women, there were all sorts of women who were just trafficked in one way or another. What fascinated me when I found it out was that some of them realized that even under British colonial rule, which, as we all know, has its pros and cons, has its drawbacks, they found that they actually had a little bit more rights under British rule than they would have if they went back to China. There are cases of women who actually wanted to, even though they were sex workers, would rather be doing that in Hong Kong than be back in China. And that sort of struck me. And you get this thing, well, you know, if you have to choose between empires, which do you choose, and so on. But anyway, it's a long story. But I think human relations, you know, with or without sex, I mean, they are the sort of essence of things, don't you think? I mean, they're by far the most interesting aspect, why we do what we do, why you're here.
I think one last question for me, and then we're going to open it up.
Yes.
And I'm sure this is the moment, by the way, that you get 5 minutes to prepare your question. So when I ask you for questions,
But only 1 minute to ask it.
You don't look down at your feet, or you don't pretend to start reading the book as in the front row. So I mean, sex, drug, class. This is something comes out in quite subtle ways in your book, rather than in very, very overt. So your book does very, very well to open up the kind of web of the comprador system whereby agents represented the big firms like the Jardines and the Mathesons and so on. And I think best exemplified in that long, long account of Ho Tung.
Yeah.
Of course, a fascinating Sir Robert Ho Tung, to those of you who don't know. And the enormous lengths they went to secure their families in the future from these diverse backgrounds. And you have a very telling way of capturing that. The I can't even say it, the oligarchization. They became of power. In other words, they created themselves as oligarchies of power. And this has had huge long-term ramifications across the decades, right until, just to give you some idea. So who's the biggest casino owner in Macau and so on?
Stanley Ho.
Stanley Ho.
The black sheep of the Ho Tung family.
Great-great-grand-nephew of this guy. And just 3 years ago, the richest gift to the British Museum in London, astounding jade and other connections.
Joseph Ho Tung.
A great-great-grandson. So, so this is what I mean by the sort of long-term genealogies and whatever.
He really has read
the
it.
securing of the sort of lineages of power, if you like. Just reflect a little bit on that. And the waxing and waning of those fortunes.
Right. Well, I think that's something that's not confined to Hong Kong. You'll have that here. You'll have that pretty well anywhere. Once a family has come up out of difficulty into wealth and some degree of power, however they've done it. I think what is significant is in these families that we're talking about, it's the exercise of patriarchy. These are men who are in charge and who are wanting to secure their legacy through the male line. It rarely worked very well, got to be honest here. You can't be sure that your sons or your grandsons are going to do the right thing. But I think that's a typical product of probably, actually, you could say migrants anywhere. You want to get secure, you want safety, you want to be sure that you're going to be safe, not just for your generation, but that your children are doing fine and their children will do fine too. So to me, what is actually missing from this book, I'm basically only talking about the elite Eurasians. I mean, I try not to. There are bits where I really talk about all sorts of normal people doing normal things. And I tried very hard in the course of research to talk to a lot of less wealthy Eurasian families, but they were the ones who didn't want to talk. It was also a kind of, I guess I was looking for where the power lay in early Hong Kong and how do you do, I spent months, how am I going to define power? How am I going to define success? You know, what does that mean? Because what it means to these guys is actually, frankly, not what it means to me, obviously. I wouldn't be writing books if that's what it meant. But the function of once you get your first million and so on, and then how you want to secure it and you want it to last, that is what produces this oligarchization, not what we would want on radio as a word.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Later, to conclude, I'm going to ask Vaudine to address her final chapter in the book. You can go and look it up. What is the final chapter, epilogue? But we're going to look it up later. There must be questions from the floor. There must be. There are people in the room,
and they really don't have to be about sex.
There are people in the room.
No pressure. No pressure, David.
There are people in the room who know Hong Kong very, very well. There's somebody from a Portuguese Hong Kong background, a friend of mine, sitting in the second row. Questions, please. There's a microphone that will come round. If there's not for the people at the back.
It's being recorded.
Okay, I have a question. Testing.
Stand up and project that. It's being recorded.
Testing.
Okay, good.
Hi, Dan.
Right. Hi. So when you were tracking the Sephardic Jew pieces that were influencing into Hong Kong, did you track into the Sephardic Jew influences that were coming out of the Mediterranean, that were setting up the ghettos, that were providing business intelligence throughout that Mediterranean in the trading influences that was going on? And did any of that track into anything that you discovered while you were in Hong Kong?
He starts with the sticky one.
Specifically Ragusa.
At some point when you're researching your book, you have to stop. But no, most of the Jewish clans in Hong Kong and I think in Southeast Asia will trace their roots back to Baghdadi Jewish clans. And, maybe before that, they can claim their Sephardic roots. And indeed, the Kaduris are a very good example. Who first arrived in Hong Kong as clerks in the Sassoon enterprise, but have now even joined Club Lusitano because of their Portuguese roots way back earlier, generations earlier. And there are Kaduris earlier who built a synagogue in Porto. So yes, there are Sephardic roots back. But there are other Jewish families in Hong Kong who are you know who I mean, Romanian Jews who left in the 1890s and went over through America and turned up in Hong Kong in the early 1900s. So, there's every variation. Belilios stands out because indeed of the Venetian link, his family is there. There are other families who have come through, well, they've intermarried with each other. So there were an Austro-Hungarian strain married into a Levantine, Livorno, Aleppo, Port Said, Cairo strain, and then from Marseille went to Shanghai to Hong Kong. So there's every variation possible, but I didn't spend a lot of time back on the Iberian Peninsula. I apologize.
You capture that by the term matrices, yeah? You have these like matrices where
Yeah.
people connected across, and a lot of them are rooted in geographies of origin, as you just said. I'm quite unwell, as some people know, but I'm coming down to the floor to coerce people to ask questions.
No, you don't
Have
need
you
to
read
coerce.
the chapter on honey?
No.
That'll be the next chapter. Yes, please.
Good evening, Vaudine.
Hi.
My name is Danny Gun. Yeah. Just wondering, I would imagine that this book would have been launched in Hong Kong, right?
What?
Has this book been launched in Hong Kong?
Yes.
Yes, but assuming it hasn't been, and I don't know anything about it, what would you say would be the reaction of the current generation of Hong Kongers in the 20s and 30s to a book like this?
Well, it's hard to say this with due modesty, but I've been really pleasantly surprised. People are still coming to me on the street in Hong Kong about this book. I find it. I think it had very lucky timing, in that, Hong Kong's gone through some ups and downs in recent years, and this is a book that helps Hong Kong people remember where they came from. I think there's a bit of a nostalgia trip also going on. Thank you for nodding. And so this book has been sort of latched onto, even again by young people, and actually the younger descendants of some of these families who I never met in the course of my research. I focus on 90-year-olds if possible. I want to get them before they die. And so I hadn't met, the 20-year-olds until they come to the book launch and say, oh, and by the way, my great-great-great-grandma was, this one you're talking about here. And I'm thinking, oh, my goodness. So in short, nobody has yet come to me and said a bad thing. So, of course, I'm only hearing the good stuff. But I am seeing them come to the talks that I do in Hong Kong and wanting to connect. The most bizarre experience I had once was a talk in Oxford, and a guy stood up and said, oh, yeah, and he looked absolutely entirely British. Old-fashioned definition of British, a proper white British gentleman with a perfect British accent. And he said, yeah, that fourth Lamb sister, she's my great-great-great. Just like, you're kidding. Carl Anderson's grandson. So it was quite astounding. And he traced himself through the book. So yeah, it's been fun.
Lovely. You had one go. Okay, have another.
Question
Go.
was actually more on a political bent.
Oh dear.
Yeah, oh dear. Oh dear. Because that's the interesting part of Hong Kong now. The event since 2019 has
Yeah.
basically shaken up the Hong Kong mood, so to speak, right? So
I
how
can
would the
agree with
people,
that.
how would the people say who have left and taken on the British overseas passport kind of
Oh.
scheme in England? How would you imagine they would react to a book like this?
Well, I think we've got the same problem with this question as we have with the whole sort of rewriting of history thing. We can't sort of generalize about all these people. Some people have left Hong Kong because it was just time for them to leave Hong Kong. Others have left because they didn't like the way the place has been developing. Yet others have left because they are hardcore activists. And, there are kind of all sorts. I'm trying very hard not to, I don't want to get waylaid by too many grand theories, whether they're political or not. The focus here is the first 100 years. And what you'll find, and I guess what I'm saying, I'm leaping ahead to your last question, that to me, a fully functioning port city needs to be open to people of all kinds, of all faiths. It needs to have freedom of association so that everybody can sleep with each other. It needs to have freedom of, I would argue, speech. It needs to have freedom of faith. That all these different people who come and build their own temples and synagogues and mosques and churches and cathedrals and whatever, and they could do different things. Same as here, right? In the beginning. So to me, that migration is essential, openness is essential, diversity is essential to a functioning port city. And I'm just talking about that time when Hong Kong was part of this chain of Asian port cities. That's how I see it. And how that is now, I mean, everybody has their own opinion, and I am not going to go there.
Just to say this, I am going to ask Vaudine to reflect a little bit on her epilogue. But let me just say this. This has been live streamed. It's out there. It's in the public domain. And I think Prudence, she's a very important lady here tonight. Vaudine needs to be able to go back to Hong Kong. She needs to be able to...
But, I mean, there's no problem with what I'm saying. And that's, I mean, I've in a way already reflected on the epilogue, and I think that's what I'm saying in the epilogue. That, and look, I mean, already in the 60s, a lot of the Portuguese people we know already left, and they went to Australia. Already immediately after the war, I mean, the British were not great in their treatment of the Eurasians. I mean, there were things called like the Eurasian Regiment in the Hong Kong Volunteers. They fought and literally died for Hong Kong, and they were not given the same terms of service or pension or medical care as the so-called British. So, you know, there were people who came back from the war and thought, well, you know, sorry, I was about to say something rude. Let's move elsewhere. And they did. So there have been different waves of departure for different reasons. I mean, nothing is really fixed in history. I've also kind of found that. So, I mean, as I was saying earlier, this idea of, you know, is Hong Kong part of Southeast Asia? And of course, you know, with academics and things like area studies, which is another whole kind of worms, people would love to expand their definition of an area by adding in another territory. Oh, yes, let's say Hong Kong is part of Southeast Asia studies. And then I realized, oh, centuries ago, frankly, anything south of the Yangtze was considered Southeast Asia. I mean, that's in the Chinese chronicles. I mean, that's at a certain point in time. So these ideas shift and change over time, and people shift with them. That's what I've got to say about the epilogue. We don't need to belabor it.
Let's gather some more questions, please, from the floor.
Bedtime? Mm-hmm.
You mean Vaudine's talk was that? You say that. Any more from the floor? Yes, sir. Yes. I knew somebody would bring this up.
Well, I thought you'd expect it. No, it's interesting. There's a lady that we know here in Penang, and quite recently she was telling us about her life. Her father had a family in Ipoh, and he also had a family in Penang. And just, I thought, you know, in my lifetime it's like that. I wasn't expecting that. So the attitude is very different, but it's very acceptable now. We were talking just before we came here about the attitude of children born out of wedlock in Britain, which is perfectly acceptable now. But within my lifetime, you know, for my parents, it was beyond the pale. And it might be, you know, unfortunate for people to accept that not so many generations back, that's how Hong Kong worked.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is why there's a beautiful opportunity now, and maybe this is the point that we should end on. This book is not intended as the definitive version of, you know, exactly who was with who and who did what with whom and so on and so forth. It was quite deliberately intended from the beginning as something to prompt others to dive into their attics and find their histories. A lot of these families that I've referred to haven't sorted out their archives and haven't saved it. Some have, a lot have not. And so the idea was, maybe now's the time, because at least in Hong Kong, there are far fewer taboos now about being Eurasian. Here it means something else, and Singapore it means something else again. But if there are less taboos, then isn't that great? It means that people can now look at their own family histories without the same kind of hang-ups and restrictions that were there in the past. So what I would like to come out of this whole project is that more people do more history.
Maybe they could do something like the British television series at the moment, which is Who Do You Think You Are?
Yes.
Where they could do an Asian version, and it's very...
Absolutely. You get the budget, darling. I'll do it.
Some of the, Nick, I think some of the taboos here are still relatively strong. I have a very close friend, extremely eminent and respected person. He's willing to talk about his grandfather running opium dens and running brothels and whatever back in the 20s and 30s and so on. And a lot of Chinese money came from that particular direction, as we know. But a lot of those late Victorian families, which still exist, really don't want to talk about that. So it needs somebody with great empathy, somebody who can build trust, which is extremely vital, I think, for getting people to talk. That's what's needed. But Vaudine's absolutely right. I mean, there's not for doctoral students of Malaysia and whatever. There's for a generation. There's been very little funding for history of any kind, except for political history from above, and almost no money for social history. And it's what we deeply, deeply need, not only in Penang, but in
And it's great fun.
In Malaysia. I promised you beforehand that I wanted to finish on the other great book, or rather trilogy of books, that captures your story incredibly well. So she's not the first, she's the second, but no, she's the first historian. And that's Amitav Ghosh, the great Bengali. Well, he was originally a social anthropologist, but the great novelist. And he wrote a trilogy of novels called the Ibis Trilogy, the last of which, River of Smoke, was published in 2011. And this traces wonderfully the story of opium above everything, from the Ganges Delta through the Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and so on. In some of his other novels, he even features Penang, and it ends on the River of Smoke. And where's the River of Smoke? The River of Smoke is the river between Canton and Hong Kong and so on. And aboard his ships is this same chaotic, wonderful, multilingual, multiracial crew of ne'er-do-wells, all of whom are eventually heading via opium to the Pearl River and whatever. And I know you love his work, so
yeah,
just
he's difficult to
reflect.
get started with, but once you're into him, he's great. What it means is that there's no need to write any historical novels about Hong Kong for at least another generation. He has done it, and he has done a far more evocative and marvelous fictional representation of what I'm doing the boring footnoted version of. So, but I'm really quite sure we've talked enough, Gareth. I think people want to go. I think we should leave them and let them go home.
She's desperate for the door marked colour.
No, I think people are too.
Listen, thank you all for coming out on a Monday night. I mean, you ought to get a photo of the audience. You should later. So thank you all very much. Ki Beng, thank you very much, and the team.
Thanks to Gareth, really, truly, because he's really not feeling well, and he's managed all this.
Above
and
all,
he's
I mean,
been a
of course,
honey
just
bunny.
an incredibly insightful set of reflections from Vaudine herself. I mean, as both a historian and as an editor, you would not know it, but there are 45 pages of references, but neatly at the end. There's 30-page bibliography neatly at the end and a beautiful index. So these are the kind of things we know actually reveal the amount of work, the dedication. But none of that interferes. They're supportive of just a wonderfully written text. Now, if I haven't persuaded you to go there and part with 89 ring, yes, 89. I could do an auction when there's only 2 copies left. Please support independent bookshops, and she needs royalties from her publisher. So thank you very, very much for coming, and good night until we see each other next time. Thank you.